My message this morning is called Loving Through the Years, and I've chosen a reading this morning that is kind of a playful and poignant poem about the joys and challenges of relationships that last. It's called What the Longlyweds Know. Okay? Not the newlyweds, but the longlyweds. What the longlyweds know. The longlyweds know that it's not about the golden anniversary at all, but about all the unremarkable years that Hallmark doesn't even make a card for. It's about the second anniversary when they were surprised to find that they cared for each other more than last year. And the fourth when both kids had chicken pox and she threw her shoe at him for no real reason. And the sixth, when he accidentally got drunk on the way home from work because being a husband and father was so damn hard. It's about the 11th, 12th, and 13th years when they discovered they could survive a crisis. And the 22nd anniversary when they looked at each other across the empty nest and found it good. It's about the 37th year when she finally decided she could never change him. And the 38th when he decided a little change wasn't that bad. It's about the 46th anniversary when they both bought cards and forgot to give them to each other. But most of all, it's about the end of the 49th year when they discovered that you don't have to be old to celebrate your 50th anniversary. Now, there are some folks in every congregation who each week need to be able to take away from the sermon at least one very concrete piece of advice. Something tangible, something practical, something they can apply directly to their own lives. And if they don't get that advice, then somehow they feel kind of cheated by the sermon. So this Sunday, I'm just going to go ahead and get it out of the way right up front. And by offering you, at the beginning of my message this morning, this critical piece of relationship advice, which is never refinance your mortgage on your wedding anniversary. I'm afraid I speak from hard-won experience here. A while back in the days when interest rates were falling instead of rising, my husband Chris and I decided that it was time to refinance our home, or as the realtor and mortgage lender kept saying, refi, right? It's time to refi. So we went to a lender and filled out the forms and ran the numbers and got the appraisal and the credit check and did all the things you have to do to refi. It's probably more accurate to say that I did all those things. Because at the time, you see, Chris was teaching for a semester out in California, so I was the one at home who had to make the refi happen. In fact, the only thing that Chris had to do in all of this was to complete and fax to the lender a power of attorney so that we could close on the mortgage without him being there. So I could sign the papers for him, right? Well, it turns out the closing date was set and happened to fall on April 28th, the date that we celebrate our anniversary. And I got up early that morning and made my way to the lender's office where she sat me down at a conference table with big piles of paper to sign. And everything was going smoothly until the lender looked at me and asked, "Hey, where's Chris's power of attorney?" "Didn't he fax it to you?" I said. "No," she said. Well, you know what I did then. And it's the same thing that you would have done in my position. I pulled out my phone and I called Chris in San Francisco. Now, it was 9 a.m. on the East Coast at that time, which made it 6 a.m. in California, a fact I hadn't considered when I dialed. Nor had I remembered that morning that it was, in fact, our anniversary. Oops. So after a few rings, the call went through to voicemail, and I left a message that, well, you can probably imagine the message that I left for my husband that morning. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Chris awoke to a buzzing, vibrating cell phone. And when he saw that I'd left a message, he thought to himself, well, how sweet. Rob called to wish me a happy anniversary, and he called early to make sure that his was the first voice I heard today. You can imagine his disappointment then when instead of hearing the words happy anniversary, he got my rant about the power of attorney. And now himself enraged, Chris called me back and in a voice dripping with sarcasm said to me, well, happy power of attorniversary to you. And just at that moment, the lender came rushing back into the office to say, oops, my bad, I just found the power of attorney that Chris had faxed over earlier in the week. Oh. So there you have it, a little free relationship advice. Never refinance your home on your anniversary. Loving through the years. This morning, I want to invite us to consider the relationships in our lives that have lasted, that have stood the test of time. Maybe it's a relationship with a spouse or partner, but maybe not. Maybe it's with close family members or friends, or maybe a relationship to a community like the church. Any close, loving relationships that's lasted through the years. What's made it work? I'll say that I count it a minor miracle that any relationship lasts for the long haul, given all the careless and sometimes hurtful things that we can do to the ones we love the most. We make mistakes all the time in relationships, don't we? And if we're lucky, we can laugh about these things later, like the power of attorney. But sometimes we can't. And then for the relationship to survive, we must return to that deep reservoir of compassion and forgiveness, the one we've gone back to over and over again through the years, the one without which ours or any long-term relationship can survive. As someone who's counseled couples for many years, I find it poignant and sometimes painful to observe how desperately we human beings need each other, and yet how easily and often we push each other away. Somehow, after thousands and thousands of years of human evolution, we're still a little maladapted to a task that is central to our happiness and well-being. How can it be that after all this time, we sometimes feel like beginners when it comes to love? If you ever feel like throwing up your hands and saying, "Why is this so hard?" you are not alone. On the other hand, I'm also frequently surprised by and in awe of how resilient our love can be. In spite of loss, in spite of disappointment. If you've been to a wedding or two over the years, you're probably familiar with the oft-recited passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. The one that goes, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never dies. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Paul, and I don't know that love can bear or endure all things. I don't think it can, in fact. But there's also some truth here. Paul's on to something when he testifies to love's endurance and resilience, love's toughness. And the funny thing is that while Paul's words are often read at weddings, in their original context, they were addressed not to a couple, but to a congregation, to a particular religious community in the city of Corinth in the middle of the first century. In the midst of some turmoil they were experiencing, Paul reminds this congregation, lest they lose faith, that their love and care for one another is resilient and strong. Now, I was reminded of this lesson just the other day, when about 50 of us gathered upstairs in the Michelson room to listen to one another as we shared our feelings about the transitions and losses that the congregation has experienced over the last several years, from the years-long disruption of the pandemic to the departures of Reverend Adam Dyer and other staff members. For some of us, these recent departures triggered feelings about still other ministerial departures from years ago. It was clear that some of us are carrying around pain and grief and disappointment in our relationship with the church. So that night we listened to each other. We formed a circle and we sang a song and we said a prayer and then we simply let each person speak without crosstalk or correction, without needing to fix anyone or anything. We simply listened to one another as an act of care, as an act of love for one another. Going in, I'll admit that I was a little nervous. I wondered, can our care for one another really hold us in our loss and grief? Well, it did, and then some. For me, the remarkable thing about that night was that it felt as though the love and care present in the room and on Zoom not only held our loss, but that the love grew and deepened with each expression of loss, such that many folks left that evening feeling energized and renewed in their commitment and connection to one another and to the congregation. In the middle of that listening session, I experienced a moment of déjà vu. I realized that no matter how many times I've seen it happen, I still routinely doubt that love can hold the pain and loss of our lives. I doubt it. I don't trust it. And then over and again, love surprises me with its strength and resilience. And I'm like, oh, it's happening again. I'm learning all over again the lesson I've learned so many times, but always forgotten or failed to trust. So I want to thank all of you for reminding me again of the strength of our love. It's a lesson we all need to remember. Because let's face it, we will sometimes be disappointed by the people and the communities that we love the most. That's a given, right? But it's what happens next that's most important, right? If we can hang in there, if we can communicate honestly and vulnerably with one another, and if we can receive one another's honest vulnerability with an attentive care and an open heart, and if all of that is leavened with compassion and forgiveness, then there's not a whole lot that our love can't hold. Not everything, because sometimes once loving relationships do need to end, right? But our love is more resilient than we dared dream. You don't have to take my word for it, or Paul's, or even the Longlyweds. I think we just need to trust what we already know deep down in our bones and live into the promise of our own deep capacity for resilient love. May it be so, and amen.